Before we continue on, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for this webinar. Wherever you are, we acknowledge and pay respects to our First Peoples. Just a little bit of an overview for those of you that may not be familiar with Monash Partners. Monash Partners is a NHMRC accredited research translation centre with 12 health service research and teaching organisations accredited by the NHMRC in 2015. Our purpose is to connect researchers, clinicians and the community to innovate for better health for around just over 3 million people under our network, but also beyond that. And one of our key roles is to bridge the silos in our very siloed health sector and embed research in clinical care. Just a little bit of an overview. We have a number of enabling platforms across Monash Partners, as well as clinical themes. And our enabling platforms, one that's most relevant to our webinar today, is around building capacity and strengthening health services research and implementation. We've also developed a strategy around how we, our workforce development offerings, and that consists of a number of different opportunities. We offer large-scale, low-cost or no-cost courses in priority areas that Monash Partners delivers, and we do that in consumer and community involvement, and this network event is another example. We also have co-developed offerings aligned with Monash Partners priorities, which are co-branded and offered at a discounted rate to members of our network. And there are also a lot of education and training offerings delivered by our member organisations and available across Monash Partners that we promote as well, where those members offer them at no charge to members of our network. The focus of today's event is our Implementing Improvement Network, and the work that's this event builds on a large program of work that Angela Melder led, and I'm joined by her today. And that was really to do a piece of research around how we might build capacity for healthcare improvement across the Monash Partners network. And some of the key themes that came out of that project were around the opportunity to lead and initiate improvement work to achieve positive impact in healthcare, to improve and enhance capability and opportunity, and also, most importantly, to create opportunities to connect with colleagues, consumers, health service leads and clinicians and patients around how we might improve care, clinical practice and health systems as well. So the Implementing Improvement in Healthcare program and network has been co-designed and has been led by Monash Partners in partnership with the Monash Centre for Health Research and Implementation, MICRI. The aims of the program are to strengthen healthcare improvement across our network through intensive coaching and training that supports the real-world application of implementation science methods. And this aspect of the program is delivered and supported by the MICRI team, and Rhonda Garad leads that work and joins us today. And the other part of this body of work is around providing opportunities to share and learn from each other through an implementation and improvement network. And this event aligns with that opportunity and is supported by Monash Partners. Here's a diagram, just a schematic of the Implementing Improvement in Healthcare program. It consists of teaching workshops scheduled throughout the year, as well as collaborative coaching webinars where participants in the program have an opportunity to link in with Rhonda and other members of the team and get individualised coaching around the application of implementation science methods in health service settings, and particularly in the project that the participants are leading. And the Improvement Network is an online event series featuring guest speakers. We hope next year that we'll be able to offer some face-to-face networking events as well. And we're in the process of bringing together some online resources and hosting those on the Monash Partners space to support implementation science and healthcare improvement in our partner organisations. Before I hand over to Rhonda, I'm joined now by Helena Teed, who's the Executive Director of Monash Partners. And Helena, if there was anything you wanted to add to what I've already presented to the group, you're welcome.
You did an excellent job, Angela. I fell for the trick of not having the password in the calendar invite, so I apologise for joining a little late. I'll introduce Katherine after Rhonda. Would you like me to introduce Rhonda?
That would be terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. So Dr. Rhonda Garad is an exceptional educator and facilitator at Monash University, and she's been with the university now for quite some years with a nursing and practitioner background with a PhD in health literacy and health equity. So she currently has a role as the Head of Education at the Monash Centre for Health Research and Implementation, has worked closely with Angela Melder, who was working with Monash Partners in this space. And Rhonda's going to tell you about the integration of different offerings that are available around improving implementation science expertise before we hear from Katherine Harding. So over to you, Rhonda.
Okay, thank you so much, Helena, and it's great to be here today with you all from the lands of the Bunurong people, to whom I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So as Helena said, part of my role at MECRI, I have the privilege of heading up much of our implementation education, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So really just talking about our education and training to support healthcare improvement and implementation science. So I'm going to talk about some of the university offerings we have in the various Monash master's streams, and then also some of our skill building workshops and mentoring programs that we deliver. I've been asked to talk about what people come to our courses, or what they feel they need and why they're coming to our educational offerings, and how education can perhaps change our approaches, and also what the value proposition is around our education. So in the master's program at Monash University, we have two offerings. So one is a full semester long program, which equates to 6 units in the master's program. So this is in the Master of Health Management, and it is the implementation and innovation in healthcare. So it is a very a comprehensive offering in terms of covering comprehensively the theories, frameworks, and models that underpin implementation science within a health context. We also offer a shorter, more intensive master's program, which is also master's unit, which is also equivalent to 6 units in the master's program. And that sits under the Master of Health Administration. So that covers healthcare improvement and learning systems. So it's very intense, and it is for those people who are moving through the master's program at a lightning speed. I won't go into this in too much detail because Angela just covered most of that, but just to say there's a variety of offerings around workshops and mentoring programs. And so there's a number of entry points that people can use and access, shorter programs, longer programs, or year-long mentoring programs where they can take a project from its conception or right through to an advanced stage of delivery, and have support, peer support as well, and almost a community of practice support around delivery of that program. We also at MECRI, so the Monash Centre for Health Research and Implementation, we offer 2-day workshops, which are largely an introduction to implementation science, but also very much with a focus on applied implementation within a health context. So it's very much about real world impact and skills that you can immediately use. What we do in those 2-day workshops is take your project, the project you have in mind, or the change or the improvement that you're working on, and over the course of 2 days, we advance your skills and knowledge around that project, working through some frameworks and processes to help your understanding of an implementation process. We very much work on the premise that everybody comes to these workshops with their own experiences and their own expertise. And so we harness that and draw on that and build on that. So we certainly don't work within a tabula rasa mindset. We're very much very cognizant that people come with often a high level of skills or experience. And so we are simply adding to that. So why do people tend to come to these courses? And their reasons are varied, but generally they want to make a change for the better. People in healthcare, you will all know, often very altruistically motivated, and people want things to get better, better for patients, better for staff, better for health systems. So people are often highly motivated to make things better for everybody. Sometimes they're frustrated by organisational inertia or their own failure in being able to complete or successfully implement a change process. So they're looking for tools, knowledge, skills to help them more successfully deliver an implementation outcome. Or often they've got a new role and suddenly it is their role to implement or improve or to make changes. And so they are suddenly thrust in a position where they feel they need these skills. So they are trying to retrofit their skill set to make sure that they can deliver on what they are required to do. They want to make impactful and sustained change. So they want to understand a way that gives their improvement or their change the best chance of being implemented, being impactful and being sustained, which is really important. They want to understand the theories, the concepts, the definitions, the frameworks. They want the language and the lexicon so that when they're in their workplaces, they can feel confident that they can speak with authority around the concepts of implementation science. That gives them confidence. Knowledge is confidence. And so that gives them the confidence to either initiate or be part of an implementation or an improvement process. So it's often about feeling as confident in that situation. And suffice to say that rarely in any of our disciplines that we in our training do we get any of this knowledge. So it is very much outside most of our skill sets. But suddenly, you know, we are required, and it is increasingly becoming a core part of leadership, the ability to be able to implement and sustain change. They're also looking for peer support. They're also looking for a community of practice, or they're also looking for a base of people that they can come back to and confer with and build their skills, knowledge, confidence through that process. And you know, what is the value of a formal education process in this space? So certainly, you know, all of us are constantly part of change. Change is never constant a reality for most of us. So we certainly have our own experiences and our own professional experiences. But I think what the value of a formal education process is that it gives us a different mindset and it helps us understand the tools we have at our disposal to deliver a deliberative process. So as opposed to a more organic or random change process, which are occurring all the time, a formal evaluation education process can help us understand the system-wide drivers and how we can influence and impact those and make us think more broadly about change. So what I observe is that before people enter into a formal education process, we tend to, and this is common of many of us, that we tend to work in a siloed approach, and we often are trying to make change by ourselves or in a very small team. And some people's role is to make change, and they're often trying to do that in a very isolated way. They may have a very narrow focus on what the problem is and not understand how that impacts more widely in the area they work or the organisation they work. They often think of change as we used to think of, you know, behaviour management as a linear process, that we start here and we follow a few steps and we arrive at the end. And that is completely contrary to the real world and how the real world works. They often do repeat what they've seen done. which is understandable. But an education focus can give you a wider view and provide you with options that are beyond your own experience. They often will understand the power and how important understanding power and context is to delivering a implementation process. The older I get and the longer I live, I understand that power is actually really important in any kind of change process. So understanding how power works within your organisation and understanding the power of influencing is critically important to any change or improvement process. They will adopt a far more structured process after having been through a structured education program, and they will have much more impact and much more sustained impact. It's really important that so many of our initiatives die in the middle or when the funding runs out or when people lose interest. Really important, and we have an obligation to use our resources, our scarce resources, in a way that means that they will be sustained and they will be integrated into usual processes. And so I think that a formal education process actually changes people's views and certainly their understanding of the options they have and the tools and the levers that they can use to make change. And I think it makes a vast difference to how they approach an implementation process. So what is the value proposition of our education programs? So our educational offerings facilitate the structured and comprehensive conceptualisation and assessment of context and implementation of complex interventions in health settings and access to, importantly, communities of practice. So what does education do in the real world? I actually can't see that heading there. So what I think education, a formal education approach, and is certainly gaining knowledge and skills around implementation, means that we are more impactful. And we do have an ethical imperative, I believe, and many of us here today also believe that we have an ethical imperative to use our resources responsibly and have the greatest impact for the end users, who are, after all, the funders of our health services. So we have an obligation to return that benefit back to end users, and a formal education process gives us a much better chance of doing that. We can understand the power of disrupting possibilities of implementation science, and I say that in all sincerity, that to make real change is often having a positive disruptive impact, and it means that you are actually making real and important change out into the world. It certainly gives you a greater understanding of how you can harness social movements for change, which is the new power, the new way of making change, which is actually a very, very successful approach to making change. And that is a whole new world of influencing and having impact. So thank you very much. That is all that I wanted to impart today, and I thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Rhonda. That was terrific, and always good to get that that I suppose body of work that's been developed over a very long period of time and co-designed with stakeholders, getting that out there. And as you say, well, Manuel said, but the key issue here is that the courses, all of them, have really good, strong feedback, and I mean that's really important to know that it's actually useful to people who do the program from a range of backgrounds.
Yeah, Helena, sorry, I just want to say if people do want more information, to contact anyone from Monash Partners or myself, and we'll certainly help them out.
Great, thanks very much, Rhonda. And I think there's information on the Monash Partners website too. So it's my pleasure to introduce Katherine Harding. So Katherine Harding, Associate Professor Harding, is a Principal Research Fellow and manages the Allied Health Clinical Research Office at Eastern Health, which operates in partnership with La Trobe and Eastern Health. La Trobe is one of the affiliate partners in Monash Partners. She recently completed a Translation Research and Practice Trip Fellowship through MRFF and conducted implementation research in demand management in outpatient and community health services and advanced training in implementation science through the University of California. She has a leading role of research at Eastern Health and is supporting and promoting research amongst allied health clinicians and integrating into the Monash Partners Network, as well as building a culture of research across her organisation and more broadly. So Katherine's going to provide some insight into the work that she's been doing with some of our partners to develop a practical framework for implementation of evidence into practice. So over to you, Katherine.
Thanks very much, Lena. Hope you can hear me okay. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? Just give me a nod, Helena.
Yes, all good.
Yep, all good. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this series of presentations, and really good to see implementation science kind of coming to the fore, because it's such an important field in health services. Oops, there we go. So there's a really well-documented gulf between research and translation to practice, and that won't come as a surprise to anybody here. Many of you will have heard the often stated statistic that it takes approximately 17 years to implement evidence-based research outcomes into clinical practice. Well, this figure has received some criticism for being overly simplistic, but few would argue that we have a problem. Geoffrey Braithwaite offers a different way of viewing the issue. He demonstrated in this paper that on average only 60% of healthcare is evidence-informed or compliant with consensus-based guidelines, 30% is wasteful or of low value, and 10% is harmful. Pretty confronting stuff. Research practice gaps result in suboptimal patient care, increased risk of avoidable harm, and increased healthcare costs. As we all know, generating evidence and publishing research alone is not enough to bring about a change in practice in healthcare. So during my TRIP fellowship, I learned about a whole field of science that has emerged over the last 20 years to shine a light on this issue. Implementation science is the scientific study of methods and strategies that facilitate the uptake of evidence into practice. While implementation science can be considered a broad field of scientific study, under this umbrella term, there are a plethora of others. This image was published by Health Research British Columbia, Canada, and it doesn't even use the word evidence, which is prevalent in a lot of the terminology we use in Australia. They tend to err more towards knowledge translation and knowledge brokering. Evidence translation, for example, has been defined as a process that enables evidence to be generated through research to be applied in clinical practice, education, and policy. Effective evidence translation leads to research impact, so demonstrable improvements to human health and society. But to the average frontline clinician, I would argue that all of these different words really mean much the same thing. So today I'll lean towards implementation science when referring to the underlying science or theory, and evidence translation when talking more about the processes of getting evidence into practice. But at the end of the day, we're essentially talking about much the same thing. So, which is to make sure that health services that we deliver are based on the best available evidence. We've already heard a little bit about silos this morning, and I'm going to pivot here a little bit to talk about a second, less recognised gulf in healthcare, which results from the two separate paradigms for inquiry-based work within health services. So these paradigms are broadly referred to as research and quality improvement. And I would suggest that these are two pretty fundamental silos in a lot of health service organisations. So each of these two areas have their own support and government structures. Quality improvement work is often more visible to health services decision makers. It's often associated with expertise in fields such as organisational change. In contrast, research projects are usually held to a higher ethical standards with more robust methodology. In Eastern Health, quality improvement work is governed under the Department of Quality Planning and Innovation, or QPI, and governance for research occurs through the Office of Research and Ethics. I believe that there's potential for a greater degree of collaboration between these worlds that would allow the strength of both to be harnessed to improve care. So what's the difference? So quality improvement, a systematic approach to data collection for the purpose of achieving immediate improvements in process and outcomes in specific healthcare settings. That's one definition. There's been many others. Definitions and processes associated with QI work often emphasise the continuous nature of the process through cycles of planning, implementing change, reviewing results and acting upon those findings to achieve continuing improvement. Research, on the other hand, this is one definition, has been defined as a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So to look at a little bit in a little bit more detail and quality improvement, we tend to have more of a focus on improving systems, efficiency, cost effectiveness, productivity, those sorts of things. We seek to make continuous gains, and often there's more of an internal focus on local problems. Research, and I'm going to say here health services research, because I think that's the sort of the most closely related field to quality improvement, is more about generating new knowledge. It's about having a specific research question, testing hypotheses, and often has a little bit more focus on external validity in the study design. So it's not quite so local, but they're each interrelated. So quality improvement work arises from an awareness of a problem, delving into the issue to identify root causes and involving those directly impacted by the issue in coming up with solutions at the local level. So in the process, ideas can be generated that can be tested using research methods to generate new knowledge that can then be generalised beyond the original setting. In turn, quality improvement methods can sometimes be well suited to implementing evidence generated through research methods into clinical practice, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Most importantly, perhaps, and particularly in the fields such as implementation science and health services research, both approaches share common ground. They use a methodical approach to inquiry with the overall aim of improving the care that patients receive. And to the average clinician on the ground, wanting to undertake a project to improve the care that their patients receive, does it really matter if they call their project a quality improvement or research project? A couple of years ago, we undertook our own investigation to explore this question in Eastern Health. This was the paper that resulted from that work. And basically what we did is identify a sample of allied health-led quality improvement research projects submitted through the relevant approval channels at Eastern Health over a 12-month period. We selected projects that were led by allied health professionals because we observed that among this group of professionals, there was a fairly even split in the path that these professionals were choosing in their approach to inquiry work. So some were going down the research path and some were going through the QI path. We identified 13 QI projects registered that had been registered by uploading their A3 QI planning documents to an online register. So this was the kind of the higher level QI projects within the organisation by definition of having been uploaded to this register. So they weren't the really local level ones. And there were also 15 research projects approved by the Eastern Health Research Ethics Committee over 12 months that met our inclusion criteria. So we surveyed the project leaders about their projects and we asked them things about what motivated the project, what the outcomes were, whether findings had been implemented into practice and so forth. And we also assessed the documentation for each of the projects. So this was the ethics documentation for the research projects and the A3 documentation for the quality projects. And we assessed them using the Squire tool, which is a checklist designed for reporting of quality improvement projects. But the items were also considered for relevant for reporting research, and by coming a little bit more from the QI perspective, we felt like we would be evening the field a little bit for the quality projects. So what did we find? Well, there are a few things. So first of all, the research projects tended to be governed and supported through the Allied Health Research Office and the Human Research Ethics Committee, not surprising. They were more likely to be led by someone with higher degree research training. They were more likely to be disseminated externally. There was more comprehensive documentation of the methods. Some were more likely to have external, well, more of them had some external funding, although not all of them. And they were certainly far more likely to use some kind of statistical reasoning in their analysis. Quality improvement projects, in contrast, tended to be governed and supported through the Department of Quality Planning and Innovation. That wasn't a surprise. They often aimed to evaluate a process. They were more likely to be led by managers. They were more likely to be disseminated internally and to be documented using templates. The information provided was often quite limited. So they didn't score nearly as well on that Squire tool. They tended to be conducted with internal funding, but they were actually more likely to lead to local practice change. But most of those findings that I just presented probably won't come as much of a surprise. But what was perhaps more interesting to us were the similarities. There was a huge amount of common ground. So, for example, the background disciplines of the people undertaking the projects were very similar. There was no kind of fundamental difference in the types of people who selected to do research or quality projects. They came from similar settings. They had very similar reasons for initiating the project. As was touched on in the presentation earlier, it was all about solving problems or improving care. A lot of people did from both kinds of projects sought out support, but albeit from different places. They used, there's a lot of crossover in the methods that they used to collect data, audits, routinely collected data, some qualitative methods. There were examples of economic analysis in both types of projects. There were kind of award and recognition schemes amongst both groups. They nearly all involved consumers as participants in some way, although neither the quality projects or the research projects had used consumers in the project design, the aspects of delivery of the project. So that was quite interesting, although bear in mind that now we're now going back about 3 or 4 years, so I wonder whether that might be gradually starting to change. Both groups had completed some internal presentations, and there are examples from both about one project generating another new project. So what does all this have to do with implementation science? So we've already established that there's an evidence practice gap and that addressing it will require deliberate action. There's a large body of evidence to inform health services about effective strategies for research translation. The National Health and Safety Guidelines state that health services should have processes that support clinicians to use best available evidence. But in contrast to the well-established support structures and governance processes for quality improvement projects and empirical research, systematic approaches to research translation in large health services seem to be rare. So furthermore, there's a lack of capacity within the health workforce to design and implement successful evidence translation projects. At Eastern Health, we could identify examples of good implementation projects, but there were no specific guidelines or frameworks to drive this type of work within the health service. And certainly, as was discussed earlier today, there are education programs and opportunities for people to starting to address this gap. But traditionally, we've kind of had this body of work around research and around quality improvement, but there's a gap here with implementation science. So following development of a new research strategy for Eastern Health in 2018, a committee was established to guide implementation of that strategy. So one of the priorities for this committee was to develop a framework for implementation of evidence into practice at the health service. So this is where I ask the question, implementation science, is this where quality improvement can really meet research? And the threads of where the two threads of this work come together. So we've established that at Eastern Health, like most health services, we have these two separate paradigms under which project work gets completed, which are broadly referred to as research and quality improvement. So each has its strengths and associated areas of expertise, but also share common ground. And in particular, both share the aim of improving patient care. But if we want to support clinicians to drive the implementation of evidence into practice, we need to harness expertise from both fields. We need a scientific approach and use of rigorous methods to appraise the evidence, to collect the data and demonstrate effectiveness, but we also need to change behaviour. And to do that, we need to understand the methods of change management. We need to be able to recognise champions on the front line. We need to be able to conduct audits and provide feedback. We need to understand barriers and facilitators and have a systems approach to problem solving. The latter are all skills that are often associated with quality improvement and where the QI leaders within health services can make a really important contribution. So perhaps this is where implementation science perhaps this is where QI really meets research and is a place where we need to harness the best of both worlds to develop a framework for conducting practical approaches to project work that facilitate implementation of research into practice. So tasked with this, this job of trying to, develop a framework, we came up with a number of driving principles for developing a framework for evidence implementation projects at Eastern Health. So firstly, we wanted to harness the existing human resources for project work. So at Eastern Health, there's already an expectation that clinicians in a broad range of roles will integrate service improvement work into their usual practice. These projects are sometimes part of formal training programs. So that's like, those undertaken by the medical registrars, for example, are a good example. Or also sometimes these things are incorporated informally into performance development goals, for example. The time and energy that goes into these projects are valuable resources that should be used for maximum benefit. So if we could redirect some of this time from traditional quality improvement or minor research projects, so such as audits of medical files that are favoured often by, particularly by some of the medical registrars, into practical evidence-informed research translation projects, this would have the potential to provide an excellent return on investment. Secondly, we wanted to get people choosing evidence wisely. So before any evidence is translated into practice, we need to be confident the evidence is robust and applicable to the setting. Peer-reviewed clinical practice guidelines published by reputable organisations offer the most reliable source of balanced evidence for clinicians, although sometimes there might be other sources like high-quality systematic reviews. We wanted clinicians to select evidence-based implementation strategies. So there's a large body of evidence to guide individuals and organisations implementing research into practice. So there's a range of strategies that have been shown to work and others that have been shown to be less effective. So promoting awareness and supporting selection of appropriate strategies and thereby building capacity of the Eastern Health workforce had to be a key component of the framework. We wanted to build on existing recognisable tools. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and we certainly didn't want to create another silo. We wanted to use tools that were already familiar to many clinicians across Eastern Health and regularly reviewed and tabled with relevant governance committees within the organisation. We wanted this to seem familiar, not something new. And we wanted to maintain the existing governance and support reporting structures so that in creating an evidence, creating evidence translations as sort of a third pillar of project work alongside research and quality improvement. We didn't want to create yet another independent system for governance and reporting. So we wanted to work within, what was already working well. So there were essentially three aims of our evidence implementation framework. So firstly, we wanted to be able to guide some of the energy currently going into other types of project work, specifically into evidence translation projects. We wanted clinicians who were interested in project work or felt that they needed to undertake a local project as a requirement of their role to consider evidence implementation projects as an option. And in order to do this, we needed to provide the guides, tools and processes to support this kind of work. So there's a bit of a danger in recent developments in implementation science that the field is becoming so full of complex frameworks and jargon that it becomes out of reach of the frontline clinicians who are in the best position to change practice. So doctors, nurses, health scientists and allied health clinicians focused on the day-to-day care of their patients unlikely to have the time or inclination to familiarise themselves with the intricacies of the consolidated framework for implementation research or the theoretical domains framework or the behaviour change wheel. Now, that's not to say these things are not important and that some people will go on and undertake more extensive learning in these areas. And we need that. But we also need clinicians on the ground to understand some basics around how to implement evidence into practice. So our aim was to come up with some practical tools that would guide clinicians through a deliberate evidence-based approach to reducing evidence practice gaps. And by encouraging clinicians to learn by doing implementation projects, we aim to eventually build the implementation science capacity of our workforce. So just briefly, I'm going to run through, what this actually kind of looks like in practice. So, what have we actually done? In some ways, you might say, actually not that much. And that's the whole idea. So we decided to begin with the existing A3 tool that's used by Eastern Health to guide quality improvement projects, which basically looks like this. It has 8 steps. Users identify the problem, set a target, do some work to understand the current state. They synthesize their findings, identify some possible actions, make a plan, review the outcome, and consider how to sustain the changes. So it's supported by training modules and coaching from the QPI team and a variety of tools and templates and reporting structures for different types of projects. So overall, the system works well to drive continuous quality improvement at Eastern Health. So in setting up a framework, we decided to use this as the starting point. So our aim wasn't to create a third silo for implementation research. We wanted to take what was already familiar. So in adapting this to implementation projects, we've decided to basically keep the underlying tool the same, but to set up some different supports around it. So we've deliberately kept the principles of the 8-step process, but we're setting up some guidelines for how each section of the template should be approached for an implementation project. So for example, under the problem background, we ask people to consider what's the evidence practice gap and to consider what the source and the strength of that evidence is. To have a target, a measurable goal still, that doesn't change all that much. In terms of the current state, it's about directing people towards more specific questions that are relevant for implementation science. So to what extent is the evidence currently being implemented into practice? What are the barriers and facilitators, and what would need to change in order to implement the evidence? These findings are synthesised. We guide people towards specific evidence-based strategies from implementation science literature. Plan which of those strategies will be used, how, by whom, and over what time frame. Do some serious work around outcome measurement, including things like sample size estimation and the number of data points and the time frame. So we wanted people to be able to be confident about, if they observe a change in practice, to what extent can they be confident that that is a true result. But we also want them to consider sustainability and to outline a plan for sustainability and maintenance. So I'm just going to take you through, there we go. I'm just going to take you through a brief example just so that to illustrate how this is intended to work for a typical frontline clinician. For illustration purposes, I'm presenting a fictional case study that's taking place in Sunnyside Hospital. This gives us a bit of artistic license to, add content from here and there that helps to explain ideas. But the case study itself is based on work done at Eastern Health by David Snowden on implementing post-operative mobility guidelines following hip fracture surgery. So this is perhaps a little bit small, so don't worry about reading every word. This is lifted from a document that we've produced as an example for our clinicians, but I'll just talk through some of the key points. So guidelines published in the National Institute of Care Excellence in the UK recommend that patients who've had a hip fracture repair should ambulate within 24 hours after surgery. It's based on high quality evidence, and at our fictional Sunnyside Hospital, clinicians were reporting that people aren't getting up until day 2 or 3, especially after weekends. Well, Sunnyside isn't so different to Eastern Health at the time this work was done. So we have a dedicated clinician embarking on an implementation project, let's say setting a target to have 90% of patients out of bed on day 1 in accordance to the guidelines. So, the current situation analysis might look something like this. It might involve a patient history audit and talking to the staff. And we've suggested that there are a number of findings from this. Some very much reflect reality Eastern Health, and there's a little bit of artistic license here as well. But an audit showed that about half the patients were got out of bed on day 1, but the situation was a lot worse on the weekends. There's a bit of an issue with surgical post-op instructions not being clear. And from talking to staff, and looking at the weekend physio list, there's an issue that these patients were not being prioritised. And the junior staff reported that they lacked confidence to get people up soon after surgery due to concerns about medical stability, managing all those tubes, etc., etc. In terms of facilitators, they also identified that staff on one ward seemed a bit more ready and interested in changing practice. And there was one surgeon particularly who was an advocate for change. So to distill that down, it seemed like there were 3 major issues: the junior staff lacked confidence, lack of access to weekend physio, and lack of clarity in post-op orders. So what would need to be done? So, to implement this into practice, we want people to start thinking about, how you'd address this. So we want better post-op instructions. We want to build the confidence of junior physio staff, and we want to make some changes to improve access to weekend physio for this client group. So, here's a number of strategies that are based in implementation science that might work, and guidance documents take people through these in a lot more detail. But for example, we've got a potential champion in an orthopaedic surgeon who's ready for change. there's good, and that person is in a good place to be able to influence their colleagues at doing something about the post-op orders. There's good evidence that direct supervision is effective in improving adherence to guidelines. And in fact, this was a key finding of the work done by David Snowden, which is the basis of this case study. So direct supervision of junior therapists through joint treatment sessions with seniors could be used to address the low confidence in this group. Change processes to make it easier for people to provide evidence-based care is another, really well-established strategy in the implementation science literature. So that could be achieved by adjusting the prioritisation criteria for weekend physio so that these patients get automatically bumped up the list. Audit and feedback is known to work well in this field. So that would certainly be important for both during the implementation and also in terms of ongoing maintenance. And there's also potential for perhaps an initial trial on Ward B and with subsequent scale up to Ward A if you've got a little bit more traction in one site. And then there's some encouragement to really think carefully about the outcome measures, taking into account things like sample size estimation, as we talked about. And then there's some thought put into how the results would be fed back to scale, in terms of including things like scale up and ongoing monitoring. So an important observation across the process that this isn't rocket science. The intention is to take the principles of implementation science and present them in a way that's easily accessible to frontline clinicians. What we're trying to do is guide people through a step-by-step process so that they can see implementation science as a legitimate choice for project work. And something that they have the skills, and knowledge to be able to tackle with some tools and some support. This isn't intended to replace the more comprehensive training that is available in this field, and that, as I said earlier, is really important. And you heard prior to my presentation about some really good examples of resources that are available to provide people with that kind of training. But we're also acknowledging that not everybody is going to do that kind of training. What we want is some people with that higher level of training who can then act as mentors for this kind of work, and those who are really just starting and have an on-the-ground idea or can be direct, who are identifying evidence that should be being implemented that's not, have a framework for how to approach a project that attempts to tackle that problem. So in summary, what we're really trying to do is bridge the gap between evidence and practice, but also to build a bridge between research and quality improvement at Eastern Health. So from research, we're looking at selection and appraisal of the highest quality evidence and taking a really analytical approach to data collection and outcome measures and sample size calculation. From quality improvement, we're bringing in things, we're talking about having a specific aim or goal rather than a research question as such. And we are talking about locally focused projects, engaging stakeholders, using other QI tools, particularly in that, looking at the current state analysis and, asking, why questions and those sorts of things. And we're also looking at continuous improvement cycles for ongoing maintenance and sustainability. But from implementation science as well, we're also looking at, making sure that people use strategies that are known to be effective in evidence translation and providing information about those in a really accessible way. And, and being guided by implementation science frameworks. There's a little bit of debate going on at the moment about whether we just select one single framework that we make the focus of this work, or we kind of borrow a bit from multiple to have kind of a list of strategies for people, sort of a menu of strategies for people to choose from. The jury's still out a little bit on exactly how we're going to manage that. So that's something that we're currently working on. But in the end, it's all about improving patient care or service delivery. So, we've travelled a long way on this road, but we still have a fair way to go yet. Oops, sorry, wrong button. There we go. So firstly, this was initiated by the Eastern Health Research Strategy Implementation Committee, which was chaired by the Chief Medical Officer and Director of Research, Dr. Alison Dwyer. That's really important because it's had this high level, approval and engagement right from the very beginning. We had a period of concept development, We've had collaboration between the Allied Health Clinical Research Office and the Office of Quality Planning and Innovation, which in itself has been a really positive process. It's been, we then prepared a document for endorsement by the executive of the health service. So again, getting that really, high-end approval. And we're currently in a stage of preparing for some pilot testing. The next steps will involve, pilot testing with a small group of projects conducted with the support of mentors within the Allied Health Clinical Research Office in collaboration with QPI. So as well as looking at outcomes of these individual projects, we also plan to use some meta-analysis techniques to evaluate the overall framework across multiple case studies. So this proof of concept testing is now in its early stages. In fact, the first participating project was recruited this week and will focus on conducting cognitive screening with patients admitted with stroke in accordance with the National Stroke Guidelines. So this brings me to the conclusion of the presentation. I hope that sometime next year we'll be in a position to share findings of the initial testing of the framework. But even the development work done to date has been a really positive experience in bringing together researchers and quality improvement specialists from within Eastern Health and opening up some really valuable conversations. So it's time to smash some silos and build some bridges. And I think implementation science presents us with a really great opportunity to do both within health services. So really happy to take any questions. I'll leave that just for a moment in case anybody wants to
Thanks, Katherine.
make a note of our contact details for further information.
Great, thanks very much. That was terrific, and always good to have more and more people working in this field. And as you said, there's a lot of overlap between quality improvement and implementation. Well, there isn't, but there needs to be a lot more overlap. Can I just ask a question while people are putting things in the chat? One of the big challenges in this space is making sure we're addressing the right problem. So you get, your documents and your resources are really helpful to identify evidence practice gaps, and we know they're everywhere. But for example, how do you know that that's the biggest challenge for your health service, or in fact, not just a passion of a clinician or of any background in their particular area? And how do you know it's the most important problem? And I ask this because of my experience in the UK is that often these really great projects like you're describing, which often don't happen in Australia because we don't have necessarily the sort of expertise that you've described. But even in the UK, the reality is people will start on a project, and it's great that you've gone as far as an evidence practice gap. Many just start because it's their interest area or their expertise. You've got a really good background around evidence practice gap, but how do you make sure that is the biggest problem that the stakeholders have, and that the problem is understood well before the solution is developed?
Okay, a couple of things there. I think one is that not everybody has to be working on the most important problem. There's no single one most important problem. Across health services, there are hundreds of evidence-based practice gaps. And if we've got one physio over here working on this one on this ward and someone else over here working on another one on another ward, I think, that's potentially a good thing. I think if you're we're not talking about, this is really intended for your really kind of local level projects where there's an identification. Well, this one that we've recruited this week for the project I was talking about, in cognitive rehabilitation for stroke patients. That's one of our senior OTs who's identified that there's a gap. That what's in the stroke guidelines is not what is being done on the wards at Eastern Health in relation to, before patients are going home from hospital. So, I think that's great that particular gap has been identified, and that there's that this is potentially an approach that can be used, to do something about that particular gap. Sorry, was there another part of that I missed? But yeah, look, I think I think if we're talking about pouring, hundreds of thousands of dollars into tackling a problem, absolutely, we need to know that it's the right gap, it's the right problem that we're addressing and where we're putting these large scale resources. But that shouldn't also stop us from working on all the little problems as well. And this is one approach to be able to do that. Did we lose Helena in there?
We just lost her. Thank you for that response, Katherine. It's a broad issue to cover in a simple way. So thank you for tackling and unpacking some of the detail there. We've got a couple of questions come up on the chat, and before we get to them, I wanted to, well, here comes Helena now. I wanted to ask about whether you'd thought through incentives for the allied health team that you lead, and even beyond it to all types of clinicians. What are the incentives that we might need to put in place to promote the involvement and participation in the approach that you put forward, in a small way or in a big way?
Yeah, look, I think part of this is about sort of substituting some of the project work that's already going on. So we're not necessarily encouraging people to do something completely new to what they would have otherwise done. It's more about diversion. We've got a whole lot of work going into sort of local improvement projects. And some of those projects are fantastic and they have some really great outcomes. There are some projects, you know, that are more successful than others. And, you know, there are often clinicians who are doing various kinds of courses or who have part of their own, you know, development plans and things like that might be to do some kind of project work. So there's already a culture of doing project work. So what we're trying to do is to say, well, if this project work is happening anyway, let's try and create a system so that some of that project work can be implementation, science, addressing evidence practice gaps project work, and put some deliberate energy into doing those, into solving those sorts of problems. So, you know, there are already incentives there to do project work. Often it's about, you know, getting that extra bit of experience to be able to go from a grade 1 to a grade 2 role, or, you know, or to be able to have something to present at a conference, or, you know, people do project work for all kinds of reasons. And some of them were talked about earlier in the day as well. You know, in relation to just wanting to improve the care that their patients receive. And so I would argue that the incentives for this kind of work are just the same as the incentives for all that other kind of work. I think for our challenge now will be about awareness and about making people aware that this is an option, you know, and to, rather than doing some other kind of project, to think about, you know, is there an evidence practice gap in my field, and can I put my project energy into that using this kind of method.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for connecting those two current work practices and the new thinking and the new approaches. We've got a question from the audience here, and it's about, I'll just read it out to you. How do you balance the benefits of implementation science being led by those with the power to endorse allocation of time required, while avoiding making it feel like a top-down process?
I think, again, this is where we're trying to build on what's already taking place within health services. So, sorry, just reading back over that question again.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I really understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so look, I think this is going to be a challenge for us in kind of trying to legitimise these sorts of projects, and that's a big part of what this framework is all about. So it's, you know, so that those with the power to endorse the allocation of time required, the same thing applies. These people are already endorsing allocation of time to other types of projects. So what we want them to do is endorse allocation of time to these kinds of projects, and to set up the systems around it so that it's seen on an equal footing as other types of projects, and that it has, by using these tools that are, you know, and forms and things that are familiar, you know, our executives on, you know, clinical executive committee and, you know, these sorts of more senior committees within the organisation are used to seeing these sorts of documents and hearing some of the same sorts of terminology. And by hitching it onto something that's already familiar, we're hoping we can increase the visibility of these kinds of projects. And that is one challenge that we often have within our health service, that we find that quality improvement work is often actually far more visible to the senior levels within the health service than what research is. And I think that's a challenge for researchers, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's also the case in other health services, but I'd like to hear people's feedback on that. But yeah, often those, and it might be to do with the people who are working in the, you know, the Department of Quality Planning and Innovation, that there's those channels up to the senior leadership a little bit more. So by kind of piggybacking onto that, we're hoping that we can make sure that these sorts of projects are visible, and that they're kind of legitimised, I suppose, you know, as a good thing to put resources into. You know, and I think if they're recognised as being a really legitimate way to use your project, you know, what project resources you have available, and that when I say resources, I mean really human resources, people who are going to be putting time into project work, that it's a good thing to do, to put them into these kinds of projects.
Thank you. Angela, I noticed that we've hit the 2 o'clock mark here, so we might stop with the questions and reflect back over the session we've had today, and take it from there.
Thanks, Angela. And sorry, Katherine, I always seem to have technical problems. I dropped out there for 1 minute and came back in again, just as you were answering my question. I'll listen to the recording. So thank you, and thank you to Angela and Melba and the Monash Partners team for pulling together. Thanks to Rhonda and Katherine, and I really applaud your work and very interested to see how it goes. It's obviously very pragmatic and on the ground, which is great. And just to encourage everyone to attend our next session, Monash Partner session, which is including Jeffrey Braithwaite, who's a world expert really in quality and safety through innovation and improvement. And so he will be down in December. We'll send you the details, and we look forward to seeing you then. And I hope Katherine will be okay if people want to reach out and find out more about your great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine.
Thanks, Katherine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.